I just had a long overdue catch-up with Brad, and to check on how Emily's family were doing since their tragedy. In some welcome news, they are now expecting a new child to join their family. Brad had another story for me, though. One that's kept me awake the past couple of nights. I've captured it here just to help get it off my mind. In a universe filled with choices, but with only one life in which to make them, regrets become inevitable. Regrets for things done or left undone, for words said or left unsaid. At that moment when our life is fading and we see it all over again, how would we feel about those decisions we've made? Would we be proud of those moments that defined us? Those moments alone when we think no one else is watching? How we treated those we loved and those close to us? Brad was not the only child in his family. He also had a younger brother, Paul. They could not have been more opposites to each other. Where Brad was brash and wild in his youth, Paul was introverted and contemplative. And like many siblings, their childhood was one of constant warfare with each other. Looking back, Brad admits that he was an arrogant, possessive, and obnoxious brat. Any of those traits alone would already have given him an excuse to hate on his little brother. But it was really the fear of the burnt man that started it all. As an only child, Brad enjoyed the attention and the adulation that it brought him. That changed when his brother Paul was born 3 years later. At first, Brad had loved the idea of a brother to play with. He imagined they would play together and be best friends. That idea disappeared when he discovered that Paul was a useless baby that only cried, smelled bad, and demanded constant attention. The second year wasn't much better. With Paul starting to get a larger share of Brad's toys and presents. It became really bad in the third year when Brad had to give up half his room and share it with Paul. He found they had nothing in common. Where Brad liked being loud and attention-seeking with others, Paul just babbled and talked with himself. Brad loved being outside and active. Paul preferred to stay indoors and draw with his crayon set. What unsettled Brad, though, was what Paul would draw. There would be the usual things every child draws: houses, animals, trees, and family. What was unusual, though, was every drawing of their family always had an extra person. Their parents would be there, and Brad and Paul all drawn rainbow hues. Right next to Paul would be a mysterious figure drawn in black and red. The family faces all had big smiles, but the stranger was a disfigured mess. 2 big black circles for eyes and a shapeless mask for the mouth. In every drawing of the stranger, he was missing an arm and had red streaks running through all over. Over time, this stranger began to feature more and more prominently in the drawings. Brad and his parents would no longer appear in them, just Paul playing with the stranger inside the house or outside in the yard. At first, their parents thought it was just a phase, but eventually became concerned enough to ask Paul who that was. He told them it was his friend, the Burned Man. He had always been there for as long as Paul could remember. He never said anything. He just stood there, watching and listening. They concluded it was just an imaginary friend. Granted, it was a bit more unsettling than having a dinosaur or an elf for a friend, but at least Paul wasn't drawing some real-life predator. One night, when Brad was 8 and Paul was 5, they stayed awake after their parents had tucked them in. Brad wanted to know more about the Burnt Man. Paul said that he had been in an accident, a fire that had burnt his entire body and face. It had melted his eyes away and made his arm go missing. He was very sad. Paul didn't find the Burnt Man scary, though. He had always been around, and never did anything, just watched and listened. Brad told him he was stupid for having an imaginary friend. Paul yawned and simply replied that he wasn't imaginary. He was in the room with them, right now. In fact, he was standing right next to Brad, watching and listening, as he did every night. Brad felt a chill go up his spine. He had always been a brave child, but for the first time in his life, he felt fear. He looked around in the darkness, not sure if the shadows were his imagination or the burnt man waiting for him to go to sleep. Brad didn't go to sleep that night and concluded that he needed a room of his own. He could no longer share a room with his annoying brother and his creepy friend, but he couldn't admit that he was afraid either. So his 8-year-old mind came up with an idea. His plan was simple: to make it so painful for their parents to keep them together, they would be forced to keep them in separate rooms. So began their adversarial relationship. They fought over everything for many years, and often physically. Each prank they played on each other escalated into new rounds of retaliation, all to the chagrin of their parents. It would take 6 more years until they moved to a bigger house and they were able to have separate rooms at last, before the feuds started to die down. The burnt man had been all but forgotten by this time, replaced with pure animosity for each other. But on the first night in their new home, Brad remembered waking in the middle of the night and seeing a figure sitting on his bed and watching him. It stared at him through hollow eye sockets and moaned at him through an open jaw. It reached for him with a horribly burnt hand. The other hung uselessly by its side with the lower half missing. Brad screamed so loud it woke the house, and the figure had disappeared by the time he blinked. When Paul came into the room to check what all the commotion was about, Brad told him he saw the burnt man. Paul laughed and said he hadn't seen him in years. In fact, he could hardly even remember him. In any case, he couldn't see him in the room now. Paul closed the door as he left, then reopened it quickly and shouted, "Boo!" before laughing again and walking back to his room. For Brad, the memory of it seemed very real, though. It wasn't just the terror, but the overwhelming sense of sadness he felt from the encounter. Another incident was when Paul was 17 and involved in a hit-and-run accident. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, and the doctors weren't sure if he would survive. Paul was laying in bed in a coma, with his parents crying around him. Brad could see a figure through the corner of his eye standing by the walls. It was the burnt man, watching Paul intently. "Just go already! Why are you still here? You're not wanted. Just leave us," Brad remembered shouting at the figure. He got a severe reprimanding from his parents, thinking that he was shouting at his brother. "Paul is dying, Brad. It's time to put your stupid feud behind. We're family, for God's sake. Act like it," his father had rebuked while his mother cried. The words stung Brad, especially since he couldn't explain that he wasn't shouting at Paul. He quietly fumed, and then stormed out. Paul did recover 2 days later, though, and was out of the hospital a week later. The last incident was 15 years ago. The burnt man was never seen again by either of them since. Brad had become a serious and buttoned-down computer analyst since then. Paul married and had 2 children of his own, and had saved countless lives through his job as an EMT. They had developed a grudging respect for each other, though their lives had drifted off in different directions over the years. The burnt man was just another long-forgotten childhood memory, filed away and never thought of again until recently. Only a recent tragedy brought it all back into sharp focus. A few months ago, Brad learned that his brother had died while on duty. He was on scene with other emergency services dealing with a factory fire. A chemical storage tank had unexpectedly exploded near his location, dousing him in burning chemicals. The flying shrapnel had seared off his left arm at the elbow. Paul was 32. In a life of many regrets, Brad now has one more for the list. He never did let Paul know how proud he was of him, and that despite their differences, he loved him as a brother. He regrets that his last words to Paul weren't goodbye, but a text message which read, "You suck. I've shat better excuses than that." It was said in jest about why Paul didn't have time over the weekend for a beer, but it was devastating knowing it would be the last memory both had of each other. So every now and then, Brad talks to the silence in the room, hoping that his brother, the burnt man, is still around to hear. Now, much older and wiser, he no longer fears the burnt man, but fears that the only one listening might just be himself. One that can only observe in silence, powerless to stop whatever fate awaits him, judging him with regret for the decisions he's made and is yet to make. If you made it this far, I hope you'll follow me on Twitter at KingSpookCreepy. Also, if you're feeling generous, I'd appreciate it if you donate even $1 to my Patreon over at patreon.com/KingSpook. Every dollar helps. The hope is eventually I'll be able to get enough through Patreon that I can do this full time. Thanks for watching.